Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martin Green, Director of the Australian Centre for Advanced Photovoltaics, supported by ARENA. It's based at UNSW, Sydney, but it also involves 4 other Australian universities and the CSIRO. So today I'd like to talk about silicon photovoltaics, PV, and in particular Australian impact. There's 3 points that I'd really like to make, and this first point is something quite recent. Just over the last 18 months, large fields of solar like this have become the cheapest way of large-scale electricity generation. And the good thing is that it's going to become even cheaper, and I'll go into some of the reasons I think that's going to happen. Australia has made a big impact in bringing this situation about, and through the support of ARENA, I think is going to continue making that impact. And thirdly, and this may be a new thought, but adoption of solar on a large scale is really great for the Australian resources industry. Getting on to the cheapest, this is a very busy slide from ARENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, but what they've done is collect recent auction bids for the supply of large-scale solar electricity. So that's US dollars a megawatt hour up the left, and just a timeline across the bottom there. So to the left there is the type of thing that I think most people are familiar with. In the past, solar's been interesting but more expensive than conventional options. But just over the last 18 months, you can see that everything's tightened up enormously and the costs have reduced dramatically in the many countries that are shown there. Australia's not there because this large-scale use of solar is something new. ARENA has encouraged it through its round. But the prices that we're seeing in Australia, bid in Australia, are not yet competitive with these that we're seeing internationally. So that's sort of good news, and that it means the prices here are likely to reduce rapidly as they catch up to international best practice. What I've collected over on the left is some of the lowest bids that have been received in auctions like this for different technologies. So that $59 a megawatt hour bid for coal is really low. Like you wouldn't see anything like that bid in Australia. Unlike wind and solar, the coal bid is made up of 2 components, the capital cost and the fuel cost. The really interesting thing about these numbers is not so much that the solar bid is 2.5 times lower than the coal bid, but that it's entering the range where it's competitive with just the fuel costs associated with the coal bid. So that means as costs reduce further, you'll be able to finance solar through the savings in fuel costs in generation. So I think that's likely to greatly stimulate the market once you reach that stage, which isn't far off. Why do I think costs will come down? This is a learning curve. So on the left axis is plotted the price of a module that you can see over on the right there. US dollars a watt. It's a logarithmic scale. The other axis is a logarithmic scale as well, the accumulated amount of photovoltaics produced. If you get a straight line on a graph like this when you plot actual data, you can associate a learning rate with that line. So you can see a 33% figure there on the left. That means for every doubling of production, you get a 33% reduction in the cost of the product. So this analysis here, plotting historical data for photovoltaics, shows 3 learning regions, a sort of pre-production phase, then an industry development phase with a lower learning rate, and then the present phase where we're in this region of very rapid learning, the mass production phase. The beauty of this type of curve is that it allows you to predict what future prices might look like. Like this curve here was drawn in 2012, or used data from up to 2012. But using it and projecting along the learning curve, it very accurately predicts prices that we're seeing today, 5 years down the track. The only thing that's a bit different is we're moving more quickly along that projection than the people that prepared this graph thought. So that 2020 figure of 25 cents a watt for solar likely to be reached, I think, before the end of next year. If you follow that learning curve down, you reach the terawatt accumulated volume, and by then the price of solar should be less than 20 cents a watt. If we go even further, you'll be reaching the stage where you're producing a terawatt a year of solar. And I'm mentioning that because that'll crop up later in the talk. Bloomberg were very quick to realise what all this meant. So this was a chart that they produced 2 years back that I think is very influential in cementing this idea that the future of electricity generation is going to be dominated by renewables. So this has been very important. All the yellow regions there is solar, supplying most of the new generation capacity installed over the next 25 years. However, I think the graph's very conservative. It was very brave for the time, but it's conservative. So in 2016, for example, the projected growth in solar was 20%. The actual figure was 50% growth. So things are going to happen more quickly than even the bravest analysts may think. I'd like to now talk a little bit about Australian impact, and that began in the lab. This chart here just shows the history of solar cell efficiency development. Efficiency is just a fraction of the energy in the sunlight that you convert to electricity with the cell. So UNSW got involved in the 80s, and for 30 of the last 33 years, we've held the record for cell efficiency, increasing the performance by 50% relative. Most of that earlier work was done in the US. The end result of all that activity was what we call the PERC cell. I won't have time to go into detail, but apart from mentioning the PERC cell is now taking over the whole of the commercial production. So this is just a projection for market share of the 4 different cell technologies that are now on the market. And in 2017, PERC has 20-25% of the market at present, but almost all new capacity going in is PERC based, so that the proportion of the market that's Australian developed PERC is going to grow very rapidly over the next few years. So the technology's had a big impact, but I think our people have probably had an even bigger impact. This is the team that developed the first 20% efficient solar cell. Most of the industry is now producing 20% efficient solar cells and following the sort of path that we developed, taking the efficiency up to 25%. So all those guys have stayed with the industry and done great things, but perhaps our graduate with the most impact has been Dr. Zhengrong Shi. Zhengrong was very influential, going back to this learning curve, in driving the whole industry through this industry developmental phase. With help from some colleagues from UNSW, he established the first production of photovoltaics in China. So this was the opening of his first factory in 2002. And then over the next 2 years, with a combination of good technology, he was using our experience in developing his lines, and low costs associated with producing in China, he was able to build up the company. And in 2005, he floated on the New York Stock Exchange. This was very successful. It was a very Australian affair at this stage, or pre-float. Suntech was 55% Australian owned. Of the 12 people on the podium, 5 are Australians, 3 are Americans, 4 are Chinese nationals. It was a huge success. So Zhengrong ended up raising $2 billion through further share and convertible note issues from the exchange, and that drove his company through this sort of developmental phase into the mass production phase. Zhengrong did very well. He became the first solar billionaire, but so did the investment bankers and so on that were backing him in this venture. And this stimulated a rush to get other companies developed in China into the condition where they could also be listed. So that involved boosting their technology, so a lot of our staff were recruited to take senior positions in these companies. So the orange areas are meant to represent people from our labs being recruited to go into the companies indicated. The same Australian team that set up Suntech, apart from Zhengrong, went on to set up 3 more companies in China in Australian-Chinese joint ventures with a large share of Australian ownership. 9, these new companies, 9 in total, managed to list on the US exchanges prior to the global financial crisis. And these form the backbone of the industry that's now producing these massive cost reductions. With support of ARENA, we're continuing to make impact, and I think these are the 2 most important areas. We're working with industry to perfect the PERC cell in production to sort of further drive, to provide the technology to keep this learning, accelerated learning curve that we're on, keep it going. We're also, the development of the PERC gave a 50% boost in cell performance, as I mentioned before. We're looking for another 50% boost by developing a cell that we can stack on silicon. Final bit of my talk, I'd like to talk about the impact of, on the Australian resources industry, and I think it's all good news. So this curve here just shows the global carbon dioxide emissions up to 2014, and then a trajectory past then, which is the type of thing that you'd have to do to restrict global temperature rises to 2 degrees centigrade. So if you look at that, things are really looking pretty hopeless. Even with the best effort of the 4 biggest polluters, we're going to run into a problem pretty soon where there's going to be no budget left for anyone else to emit everything if you're going to keep close to that type of trajectory. So this is where photovoltaics might provide a really critical role. So the little arrow there over on the right shows the impact of installing 1 terawatt of photovoltaics. So I said that's the level that we're about to reach in the early 2020s perhaps. But by the mid-2020s, we should be producing about 1 terawatt a year. And if you look at the impact that might have on global CO2 emissions, it just about matches that slope of that desirable trajectory that's shown there. I don't think there's anything else that's likely to happen that is likely to have such an impact on that type of timescale. But won't that be bad for Australia? So thermal coal is one of our big exports. We're the second largest exporter of thermal coal. The green line shows the value of recent exports. If we install 1 terawatt of photovoltaics, we decrease the world market for thermal coal by 600 million tonnes. That's about 10% of the present market. So that's going to have some impact on our exports. Economics is an inexact science, so I've gone for consistency rather than exactitude in trying to estimate how much impact that might have. So I've said if we reduce 10% of the market, we might expect to reduce 10% of our exports, which would be worth $1.5 billion. So that's bad, maybe good news for the rest of the world, but bad news for Australia if we cut down the thermal coal by that use. But according to ARENA again, to install 1 terawatt of photovoltaics, you'd need something like 56 million tonnes of steel. And Australia just happens to be the largest exporter of coking coal. So that amount of steel would require about 60 million tonnes of coking coal extra, 6% of the present world market. So if you bump Australian exports up by the same, you increase earnings 1.2 billion. So you've just about balanced out the loss in thermal coal through the increased demand of steel. But you also need iron ore for steel. Australia is the largest exporter of iron ore. So for that 56 million tonnes, you need about 110 million tonnes of iron ore, about 3% of the world's market, another 1.6 billion in increased earnings, so you're further ahead. But you also need aluminium, 19 million tonnes according to ARENA. Again, we're the largest exporter of alumina, 38 million tonnes. Extra would increase the world demand by 32%, Australian exports by 3.3 billion. But it doesn't stop there. We still need 5 million tonnes of copper. Australia's the 4th or 3rd, I think now, largest exporter of copper. So another increase to 2.1 billion. So in a nutshell, the gains in coking coal, iron ore, alumina, copper offset the loss of earnings we're likely to make from exporting less thermal coal, 5 times over, more than 5 times over. But I still haven't scratched the surface. There's still other resources like silver, lithium, cobalt, nickel, and so on that are likely to be important in a solar-powered future. And then finally, Australia, actually, of any country in the world, has the largest solar resources. So with the very low costs that I think we might expect from solar in future, we may be the country with the lowest cost electricity. So we could look at adding more value to our resources by doing more processing here with the very low cost electricity that we may well have. So just finishing up my 3 points. Solar PV is now the cheapest way of generating electricity, soon to be even cheaper, so it might drop to 2 or 3 times cheaper than some of the figures that we've seen. With the support of ARENA, Australia has had large impact on the industry and will continue to have a large impact, and I think this role should be encouraged because of the third point. The higher the uptake of solar worldwide, the better it is for the Australian resources industry. So thanks very much for your attention.